Hey, what's up everyone? My name's Nick, and about 7 months ago maybe, I released a video called Deceptive Practices in Multiplayer Games, something along those lines, where I share my TCG that I have open right here, where I sort of explain how it works and how I use a little bits of tricky, deceptive practices to maybe fool the player and present them with the reality that is not exactly what they're looking at. And what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be going through the code, through the documentation of the game that I worked on, the TCG that I worked on in that video, for that video. I was originally, when I worked on that video, I was planning on actually completing a game and making a game out of it. But life happened, a bunch of different things happened, and I just got really busy, and I have not touched the code in about 8 months. So I'm kind of just going into this unscripted, completely blind. I don't know what it's going to look like. Let's open up the code right now while I'm talking. I don't know. Maybe it's going to be confusing. Maybe not. I'm just going to do it one take and hopefully everything makes sense. If you enjoy the video, it's probably not a good idea to subscribe, I think. You probably won't like the other content that's on this channel, but feel free to please like the video actually, and do comment on the video, since that's going to help the algorithm. And if you have any questions, it's better to post them on YouTube instead of on itch.io, because it's easier for me to get notifications on YouTube. And when other people watch this video, maybe they might have the same questions as you have, so they can look into the comment section and they can find the answers. Also, I have re-uploaded Deceptive Multiplayer Practices video onto this channel. So it was originally uploaded onto a separate channel. I was kind of just testing a bunch of stuff. So I re-uploaded it onto this channel. So if you want to go watch that video, you can do so. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, and let's go into our build. Let's open up our game. So we're going to go open up 2 instances of our game so we can take a look at what the game looks like when you're playing in multiplayer. Let's just do player uno. You know what? Let's just do uno, because I don't know, it sounds better. And then we're going to do deux. We're going to hit him with some French. So here, as I mentioned in the Deceptive Multiplayer, we actually don't even have cards, yet our opponent has cards spawned, because the cards that are spawned into the game don't actually exist on the server. Wait, they don't actually exist locally, they only exist on the server. So this is basically what you're seeing is the hand sync list, which we're going to take a look at later. But this is just the hand sync list is populating the hands in our opponent's, the cards in our opponent's hand. So we're going to press C, it's going to spawn us a bunch of cards. We're going to press C here, do the same thing. Of course, we're pressing C to spawn the cards manually, but you don't have to do that. There's obviously a million ways to automate that process, but we want to do it manually just because it's easier for testing purposes. By the way, as you can already tell, I'm going to be going through this pretty quickly. Maybe there's some things I'm going to skip over or not talk about. So if you have any questions, you can just leave them in the comment section below. And I forgot to mention, in the original video, here if you press G, you'll start the game. So here you can see that this card is outlined in green. The other cards are not outlined in green because we don't have enough mana to play them. So here we have 1 mana, so we can't actually play this. Because we can't play it, it's outlined in green. Here we have 0 mana, so we can't play anything. If I try to hover a card and play it onto the board, does not work because we can't play those cards. And if I hover over the cards in my hand, you can see them bouncing up on our opponent's screen. So everything is working great. Grab this card, I can drag it, drop it onto the board, creates a new creature, creates a new Pokemon. And if I hover over the Pokemon, you can see right here on our opponent's screen, you can see that it outlines in blue. And then I can end my turn. Ending my turn will give this guy mana, our opponent mana. And now, all of a sudden, now I can use Duck. So I can go ahead, I can play Duck, I can end my turn. We can come back here. Now we have 2 mana. Now we can play a new card. So we're going to drop a new card. If I click and then I hover, now it's outlined in red. So the outline in red tells our opponent, hey, he's looking at this card. He's thinking about attacking this card right now. So it conveys information that is useful for your opponent. And obviously, whenever your opponent attacks, they also convey information to you. And as you can see, there's no line renderer for this one. So the arrow right now is different from the arrow in the video. And that's because my friend actually wrote the code for the arrow in the video. And he didn't want me using it for the itch.io, since he's still planning on using it for a different project that he's working on. So I just changed the code a little bit and removed the line renderer and changed the arrow a little bit. So that's kind of the basics of the game. Now we can click on our character and have him attack whoever we want. So let's just have him attack the player. Health goes down, end turn, drop a new creature, click, and then I can have them trade so both creatures die. And that's pretty much it. So let's hop into the code and take a look at what that looks like. So right off the bat, we have a bunch of folders here that you can see. We have a prefabs folder, resources folder, which is for scriptable objects, scripts, which is pretty self-explanatory, handles all kinds of scripts, and then sprites as well, pretty self-explanatory, just handles all the art that we have in this game. So if we go into the cards, we have 4 types of cards. We have empty card, which I'll explain what it does in just a second. We have field card, which is the card that is actually spawned onto the board. This card is a little bit different. It's on layer entity, which is going to be important later on. It's on layer entity, and it has a box collider. So this is going to be useful for the targeting arrow. The targeting arrow will be able to target entities, which means the field card, the card that's on the board. So the cards in our hand obviously don't have box colliders, and they are not set as entities, so they cannot be targeted. You cannot target a card in your player's hand or your opponent's hand. Although you could change that. You could program it so that that's possible. It's just not how this one works. And we also have card hover, which is field hover card right here. What this does basically is whenever you hover over a card, there's like a little pop-up box that appears that reveals information about the card. So here we just turn it on and off. When we turn it on, whenever you hover over, you have this box that appears next to the field card that has information about the card on the field. Of course, the information here is going to be populated once we actually spawn the card. So this information, it doesn't matter that it says Nick or 5/5. All of that information is going to be changed. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for the field cards. Hand card is just the cards that are going to be in your hand. So here, everything you see right now happens on the canvas. So the background, the battlefield, the player's hands here, everything is on the canvas. So let's take a look at the player's hands. And also they're saved as prefab. So player's hand, player portrait, player field, they're all saved as prefab. So you can go ahead and edit those however you want. You can just edit the prefab and it's going to edit everything else. Then we have our hand panel, which is a horizontal layout group. So once we actually start this game, you'll see that this area here, this player content area, will be populated with a bunch of cards. Let's go ahead and do that. So here, host the game. We're going to press C, and then player content now has a bunch of cards populated in this horizontal layout group. And if I press C, oh, whoops, I did not mean to do that. I spawned a couple, maybe one too many cards. But now there's a couple cards that we can actually play. So we can go ahead and select this card right here. Actually, this is going to create issues. So let's just start over instead of messing around with that. Okay, then we're going to press G. Now, if I go ahead and I drag this card up here, you can see that an empty card appears here in our hierarchy. And basically what happens, and you can also see there's a little blue box right there that appears. Basically, the empty card takes the position of our previous card whenever we drag it so that the other cards don't move or don't take its position. So we make sure that there's a spot for our card right there in the center, always ready for us. And everything that's happening here is happening locally. So whenever we hover over the cards and they pop up like this is only happening locally. When we drag the cards like this is only happening locally. The empty card spawning in your hand is also only happening locally because there's no reason for that to be happening on the server. So let's take a look at our player hand script, since that's the one that handles our player's hand, as it says. Player hand. So here we have our player class, and then we call the local player, which is a static variable that we can call and use, and it's just very convenient. Just something I learned from UMMORPG that has been very, very useful in my other projects. And then we check and make sure that, first of all, the player actually exists, that we have a player in the game, and that we actually have an enemy. So usually in a traditional card game like Hearthstone, whenever you spawn into the match, you and your enemy are already there. But in this card game, for testing purposes, you spawn first, and then your opponent has to connect to the server as well. So it's very common. You're going to have a lot of errors where your opponent is just not in the match. So if your opponent is not in the match, then let's not spawn some cards, right? Because otherwise the game is going to try to get information that we just don't have access to because there's no other player. Then here, input key down, key code, input key C. I don't know why input get key down, key code C. That was difficult. Then draw a card, pretty self-explanatory. Drawing a card right here. We grab the player's hand from the game manager. I'll explain that a little bit later. And then we grab the amount, which we pass over here, so 7 cards. We're passing 7 cards, so it's going to loop 7 times, and for every card in our hand sync list, we're going to add it. We're going to add 1 card. So that's pretty much it. Then our enemy's hand. Here we spawn our enemy's hand. So as you can see, it says slot, add card back. So if we take a look at the hand card, which is what handles the cards in your hand, the prefab for the cards in your hand. If we take a look at that, here we have add card back. Now, of course, card back. Go into the cards, hand card. At the bottom here, we have our card back right here. So if we hide the main card, actually, no, that doesn't work. Wait, what? Oh, it's transparent, I think, right? Yes. So now it's visible, and now it goes over everything else. So basically what we do is we set the default card front, the default card to clear, we set it to transparent, and then we add color, we add visibility, or we increase the transparency, I guess. I'm not sure actually how to say that, but I guess we increase the opacity, I think that's what it is, opacity of the card, and now we make it visible. And then it allows us to see the card back. Now, of course, we don't need all of this information. We don't need health. We don't need strength. We don't need image sprite, because we're only going to be seeing the card back anyways. But if you're spawning an actual card, then you're going to want to go ahead and spawn and tell it basically what properties to have. You're going to want to hide the card back. You're going to want to set the sprite. You're going to want to set the health and strength and yada, yada, yada. So if we go back to player hand, that's basically how this works. It's ran on an update function. So as soon as your enemy connects, boom, it'll spawn the cards only when your enemy connects. And whenever they use a card, destroy a card, play a card, whatever happens, it'll keep updating automatically because it's in the update function. As for the player, it's not updated automatically. It's actually updated manually. So you have an add card function, which will add the cards whenever necessary, and a remove card function, which will remove the cards whenever necessary. And these cards are spawned from the player deck hand sync list. So again, they don't exist locally. They don't exist. Yes, no, that's what I meant. They don't exist physically on the server. They exist through a sync list. So we have a hand sync list, cards in the player's hand during the match. So we have a sync list for the graveyard, sync list for the deck, for the player's deck, and for the hand. We also have a player field sync list. I don't think I actually use this for anything, but I think the idea behind this is just to track the different types of cards that we have on the field. So if we have like taunt cards, if we have like cards that have special effects, it's a lot easier to kind of loop through the player field instead of looping through the player's hand or something like that. Also, if an enemy were to disconnect and reconnect, you want to make sure that what they see on the board is accurate to what the server is showing, so you could store all that information in a player field, and whenever a player connects or reconnects, they can read through that player field to figure out what cards are on the board and in what order, because that actually is pretty impactful. So I think that's kind of it for the player hands. Now let's take a look at the drag and drop function. So if we go to hand card, you'll see that we have hand card drag hover. So we have a hand card drag hover component, and if we go into our update function, here we have if player type is player. So you have two types you have two player types. You have player and enemy. I think I've said it here. You have player, enemy. So basically, since only two people can play at the same time, if you're not the enemy, then your opponent is the enemy, right? Whoever you are not, whichever player you are not is the enemy. And then if we actually do have a card drag hover, if card drag hover is enabled, then we check the mana cost of the card. If it's our turn and we can play a card, if we have enough mana to play the card, then we'll make it outline. So card outline color, we set it ready color or color clear. So that's the green outline that you saw earlier. This is the code that handles that. Basically, if we have enough mana and if it's our turn, we can go ahead and outline the card in green to let us know, hey, you can play the card. Of course, this can be expanded to do something like in Hearthstone where they have a combo system, so you could expand this to do whatever you want. Let's take a look at the card hand drag hover, which handles dragging and hovering the cards. On pointer enter, of course, it means whenever you enter your cursor onto the card. This basically is what makes the cards pop up. So if I just run through this one more time, and I spawn some cards. Whenever I hover like this, as I said, this is just happening locally. And what we're doing is we're just changing the local scale of the card. That's it. We're just increasing the scale of the card, and we're moving it up slightly from its local position relative to where it is in the player's hand. We just move it up a little bit, and it gives this effect of you browsing through the cards. And on our opponent's screen, what we do is we call a CMD that tells it to increase or reduce the position of the card by 25 pixels relative to the card's position. So on our screen, we increase it by how much? Apparently 190, apparently. And on their screen, we're going to reduce it by 25. So we're going to have it bop down a little bit. When we exit, we set it back to normal. So we just send a CMD that says set it back to 0. And then here we also set it back to 0. And we set the scale back to normal, which is 0.5. On begin drag, this is the thing that spawns the empty card. So right here you can see it spawns the empty card to take the place of our actual card. And this is something that I got from a tutorial on YouTube of a single player card game. But of course, the same logic works in multiplayer because it's not something that affects multiplayer. It's something that only affects the player's individual local perception of what's happening. So the empty card, so there's a lot of little gimmicks and little tricks that you can use from a single player game and adapt it into a multiplayer game just because it's not really relevant to a multiplayer experience. Once you start dragging the card, I'm actually not sure what this does. Once you start dragging the card, oh yeah, whenever. So this is just means that the card is going to follow your mouse. Whenever you drag it, the card follows your mouse, and whenever you stop dragging, it sets itself back to where it was previously. So let's take a look at our game manager that handles the hovering of the cards. So here we have a bunch of different things in our game manager. Our game manager basically acts as a place to store information that we can reliably retrieve later on. Technically, you don't really need a game manager. You could probably put all of this directly onto the player field, but I kind of just wanted to separate them and try something a little bit different with game manager. But here we have the maximum health, maximum mana, the hand size, the player hand, enemy hand. So basically you tell the game manager right here, you tell the game manager which one is the player field. And as you can see, it's the one at the bottom. Where is the player field? Right here. Where is our enemy field? Which one is the player field? Which one is the enemy field? So whenever you spawn into the game, you will be able to spawn the creatures in the right fields relative to who you are. So if you're the player, whenever you spawn cards, you want to spawn it in your own field. And of course, on the enemy screen, on our opponent's screen, they're the player, so they will spawn it in their field, and you're their enemy. So maybe this can get a little bit confusing, but don't worry too much about it. Then we have a boolean to check if it's our turn or our opponent's turn. So this just determines, can we play cards or not? This should probably be a sync var, I think, because the server should be determining whether or not it's our turn or not. Players should not have access to just modify it on their own, but I don't think it's a big problem. This is the information of all players online. One is player, other is opponent. I don't actually think I use this for anything, but maybe it's relevant to just, keep a list of every single player that's connected onto the game, and then you can maybe access that information and do some stuff with that. On card hover, so this basically is what happens whenever you hover over the cards, as I was saying, like this. Is this working? Yes, whenever you hover over the cards on our opponent's screen, you're going to see them bouncing up and down. So this is where that logic is handled. So we have move by, which is the amount you want to move the card by, and then the index of the card, which is, are we moving card number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Right? And then we check to make sure so only move card for the player that isn't currently hovering. Now, I have not tested. Yes, so is hovering, I think this is a local variable, so it's not a sync var, it's a local variable, which means you're the only one that can affect it, that can set it to true or not. So basically, if you are hovering, if locally you are hovering, then that means that this card on your screen, on your opponent's side of the board, it won't move. Or I guess, yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. So whenever you're hovering a card, your opponent's side of the board is not going to move, right? We only want our opponent to see us moving the cards. We don't want ourselves be moving the card. So basically, if I move this card, I should not see my opponent's card move in that same location, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So it's like we don't want our player's hand to mimic our movements, our opponent's hand to mimic our movement. We only want on our screen we move and our opponent's screen we move. We don't need to move twice on the same screen. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't think I explained that well, but you guys are smart people. I'm sure you'll understand. And then if hovering is set to false, that means that we are not currently hovering. So the player that is not currently hovering is the one whose cards will start to hover. So if I'm the one hovering on this screen, that means my opponent is not hovering. If my opponent is not the one hovering, then on his screen, he will see his cards start to move because I'm the one hovering. So if you're not hovering, then your cards start to move. And as you can see here, I have to use a command ignore authority. I was having a bunch of issues trying to send a regular command, but it did not work, so I had to ignore authority. Again, if you put all of this into player.cs, you probably are not going to run into these issues. I don't know how much of a security threat ignore authority is, but again, this is kind of just for learning and practicing, so I don't really care too much about these more minute details. I think that's pretty much it for the card hand hover, the hovering, all that good stuff. Let's take a look at the field. What happens when we actually spawn the card onto the field? So here on our player field, we have an on drop function. So of course, this is our player field, and it has a player field script. And we have an on drop function whenever we drop our card into the field. Is this still playing? Yes, it is. Whenever we drop a card into the field like this, we can take a look at our player field, player content, and voila. Here we have a field card that has now been spawned into our player field. And basically this is the part of the code that handles that. We take a look at the mana cost, we take a look at the player, the local player, what card are we trying to spawn? Is it our turn? Can we play the card? So this is just to check to make sure that we're not doing it on our opponent's turn, we're not trying to cheat, and we actually have enough mana to spawn the card. And then we check if it's spawning. That means if you're the one spawning the card, then that means you're going to want it on your side of the board. If your opponent is the one spawning the card, then you're going to want it on their side of the board. So this boolean is used to determine what side of the board to spawn it on. This is just the hovering thing I was talking about earlier. Then we have CMD play card. I'll show that in just a second. Then we have a combat component, which I think is the first time we're actually introduced to it. The combat component, I'll explain that a little bit further down the line. Update field cards, I'll also explain a little bit later. So let's go take a look at our deck and CMD play card. So right here, CMD play card. Basically what we do is we have a scriptable object, a scriptable card right here. Scriptable cards are scriptable objects where we can use to very easily create cards. So if I go duck, shut your ass up, quacka. We have a unique ID that our creature card has. We have an image that we can give it. We have all kinds of different things. So here, if I use our duck example and I change the card to the bird Pokemon, I forgot its name, and then we launch the game, it should change automatically. So then when I spawn cards right there, we now suddenly, just like that, we have a bird in the game. So scriptable cards, scriptable objects just allows us to easily create cards and easily modify whatever we want to modify, any stat we want to modify without any headaches. But scriptable objects cannot be passed over through the network. So here we have a unique ID, as I was talking about earlier, that is created based on the assets path, folder path in the resource folder. So it's going to have a unique ID. So what we do is we create a unique ID for our card. Of course, you can set one manually if you really wanted to. If you wanted to have a different naming scheme for your IDs, you could go ahead and set this manually. It doesn't really matter. As long as it's unique and no other card shares that ID. Then what happens is that when we actually use a card, we're going to use card info. So right here you have card info is being passed over the network. So we cannot pass scriptable objects, but we can pass structs. So essentially what happens is that we are going to pass the card ID, and then we're going to recreate the card based off the card ID. We're going to recreate the scriptable card, the creature card, based off of the card ID. So you can think of this a little bit as in a Minecraft world, whenever you play in a multiplayer world, you're going to be given a seed, for example 1200. So your seed is 1200, so 1200 is going to create a unique world. Then if your opponent, or not your opponent, if a friend connects to that world, instead of sending over all the world information, sending over all the block data and all that stuff, all you have to do is send over the seed. So your friend does not need to download the map. Instead, they just take the seed and their client will recreate the entire map based off of that seed, because it's always going to create the same map with the same seed. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're not sending over the card itself. We're sending over all the data, all the information that the client needs to recreate the card. So essentially the card here, we're just recreating a copy of the card using the information from the scriptable card data. And then we spawn the card onto the board, and we spawn it as a game object, which is quite important. And our game object is a field card entity, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Actually, I guess I can talk about this now. So we spawn I'll talk about that later. So we spawn a card onto our board. Then down here, RPC play card. After we've played the card, this just determines, are we the one spawning the card? Yes, then spawn it on our side of the board. Is our opponent, do we have an enemy? And is our opponent the one spawning a card, then spawn it on our opponent's side of the board. So I think that's pretty much it. And then also we remove the card from our hand syncless because we just played it. We just summoned it. So it's not in our hand anymore. It should not be in our hand anymore. Okay. Sorry, I've been going really quickly. I think that's pretty much it for the decks. Here we have a callback function whenever our deck is updated. Whenever any of our sync lists are updated, our hand, our graveyard, our deck list, whenever anything is updated, we basically just run this callback function to make sure that our graveyard, our hand, and our deck list is always up to date with the server. So the server always has the latest hand sync, the latest deck list, the latest graveyard list, and this kind of just ensures no shenanigans, I think. Okay, yeah, so once the card is spawned into the game, then let's take a look at our entity script, because that's what we just spawned into the game. We spawned an entity. So entities, as I said earlier, field card is an entity. And if we take a look at our player prefab, is also an entity and also has a collider hitbox. So let me just take a sip of something to drink real quick. Okay, that felt much better. All right, so entities. So we have an entity class that is shared with both our player class, player entity, as you can see, and our field card. Where's our field card? Our field card is also, okay. Our field card is also an entity. How long have I been going? 27 minutes. Okay, not that bad. So a field card is also an entity so basically we said both as entities because they have a lot in common. Both of them need a combat script to deal damage and receive damage. Both the field card and the player have health and strength. Both the field card and the player can actually spawn an arrow. They can target enemies. They can target allies, enemies, whatever. So there's a lot of commonalities between the field card and the player. So it's easier to just make an entity class and then have them both be built from that same entity base. Here we have a wait turn function, a wait turn variable that just determines can we attack yet or not. How long do we have to wait before we can attack? If wait turn is 0, that means you can attack right away. So in theory, if you wanted to have a creature that has a charge attack or rush attack or something like that where they can attack right away, you would set this to 0. And if you wanted to, here it says wait turn is also used for stunning, freezing, etc. If you wanted to paralyze a minion, you could just increase its wait turn by 1 or by 10 if you wanted to, right? So that would mean for 10 turns they can't attack. And at the end of every turn, I think it's right here. Yeah, so at the end of every turn, CMD update wait turn. At the end of every turn, we update the wait turn and we reduce it by 1. So whenever you end your turn, you just reduce the wait turn of the card by 1. So as long as it's more than 0. So if it's at 0, then the wait turn is not going to be reduced into the negative values. I pinned this. I guess it's fine to pin it. Doesn't matter. So, and then taunt. Here we have a taunt boolean. It's just whether a minion is a taunt or not. I actually never built anything from this. There's throughout the project, you'll see there's a bunch of things that I started working on but never finished working on. We have a boolean to determine can we attack, can't we attack. So of course you can attack if it's our turn. If our wait turn is equal to 0, then that means that it's our turn and our minion is ready to attack. And caster type is friendly. So this is a little bit more complicated, I guess. But here we have targets and we have caster type. Caster type is you, the owner. What type of target are you? Are you a friendly target? Are you an enemy? Are you the owner? So here we have caster type, owner, opponent, friendlies, enemies, random, all. So it just means who are you relative to your owner? Sort of. I think that makes the most sense. So for our opponent's information here, player, it'll say opponent, right? And for our opponent's friendly creatures, it'll say enemies. For our friendly creatures, it'll say friendlies. And for us, it'll say owner. So here we want to make sure that the card can actually be played so that the card is a friendly card and it's our turn. So basically this means that we can't control our opponent's cards on our turn. That's what this target type prevents. Here we spawn a targeting arrow. If you right click here, if you are targeting and you right click, then you destroy the targeting arrow, which is what happens here. So let's take a look at the targeting arrow script because it is a little bit interesting. We pass over information. We pass over this entity's information. We pass over the card information, the spawn position of the card in case you wanted it not to spawn in the middle of in case you wanted to change where the card spawns, and then whether or not it's an ability. So this is just used, is ability is something I started working on for, if you take a look here, in initiatives, I started working on a battle cry system where whenever you spawn the player into, and whenever you spawn a creature into the game, if it has a battle cry, it'll loop through different commands or different attacks that it can do. And these are called abilities. And I also started working on the death cry abilities. Now, of course, death cries is the death rattles. So this is a separate field because they're triggered separately. This one is triggered when you enter the field. This one is triggered when you leave the field. So it's better to just separate them. But none of them have actually been implemented into the game. I just started working on it and it never amounted to anything. Yes. So let's take a look at our targeting script. I'm just going to write target. It can be much faster. We have arrowhead, which we're going to need. So let's just pin that for now. And then we also have targeting arrow, which we're also going to need. So this is our targeting arrow. This is the draw line script that you just saw here being called the draw line script. And we pass over the entity, the card info, the start position, whether or not it's an ability. We populate the information with what we need to do. Here we have the target type. This is where the target type is set, so you can add a bunch of targets here or change a bunch of targets, whatever you want. The naming convention for this I think is a little bit confusing. Friendlies, enemies. I wanted to keep it simple, but I think it's better to do friendly creatures, enemy creatures, something along those lines, just to make sure you don't confuse yourself. And while we are dragging, so if we spawn an arrow, we set is dragging to true. While we are dragging, then we're going to update the position of the arrow to our mouse position so it follows our mouse. And then we're also going to look for targets. So we have a find target script where we pass over the caster, who is the one who controls the arrow, who is the owner of the targeting arrow. And then in our arrow script, find targets, we send a raycast against the target layer, which is the entity layer, right? So we're only going to raycast and look for entities, which is going to be field cards and player cards, nothing else. Then if hit length is greater than 0, that means that we hit something. If we hit something, then we need to make sure that it's an entity, and we need to make sure that we can actually target. So we have target, caster type, can target, card, acceptable targets. So this is actually a really cool little thing that I made. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Then we have some more conditional checks here that we do. We have the sprite renderer that changes the target's head to default head, or target head, depending on who we're hovering over. And then we have input, get mouse down. So whenever we left click on a creature that we are hovering over, then we send an attack. So creature card data attack. So basically how attacks are handled is written right in our creature card, which is a scriptable card object. Here is where we handle the combat logic. So we have the attacker, the person that's doing the attacking, the target, the person that is receiving the attack. Sorry, I had to burp. The person that's receiving the attack. And then we basically just have the target's health be reduced by the attacker's strength. Then we have the attacker's health also being reduced by the target's strength because they're both attacking themselves at the same time. We destroy the targeting arrow, and then we increase the wait turn of the person doing the attack, so they can't attack again. But if you wanted to have a creature that could attack twice, then you could overwrite this, and maybe I don't know, you would have to do something, but you could overwrite this so that they can attack a second time. Yes, so here we call the function that calls the attack. directly onto our card. So of course, if you wanted cards to attack differently or do something different, this is where you would handle that. I just think it's convenient to have sort of like everything in one category. And here you can see field card prefab, which is actually pretty neat. So here you have the field card prefab, which of course is this card prefab. So if you wanted a card, different classes, different cards to have different prefabs when they spawn to look differently, be a different color, have a different shape like a legendary card or a taunt minion or something like that, you wanted it to look different, this is where you would handle that information. So this is really neat. It just gives you a bunch of flexibility on how you want the cards to look. And then I said there was something pretty cool here. I mean, I think it's cool. You guys might not care too much. Is that this was my first time making extensions. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something I learned from just messing around a lot with UMMORPG. This 2K used a lot of extensions, and I kind of just looked into it and thought, this is really convenient. I want to learn more about this and see how this works. So I created an extension, which is a Boolean that determines who can you attack and who can you not attack. So whenever you have a creature card, you have a list of targets, a list of acceptable targets. So if you take a look at our creature card once more, if we take a look at duck, acceptable targets, enemies, opponent. Enemies, of course, enemy creatures. Opponent is the opponent, the opposing player. And by default, here, whenever you create a new creature, by default, it'll automatically set to enemies or opponents, because that's sort of like most cards are going to be able to attack their opponents and their enemies. But if you wanted a card to be able to attack your own player or your own minions, or you wanted it to not be able to attack the enemy player but be able to attack enemy minions, or you wanted it to only be able to attack enemy minions, whatever it is you want, this is where you would set it. Then we would go into our extension here. Whenever we attack, sorry, I burped again. Whenever we attack, we check can target. So we check, are we allowed to target this creature? And then we pass over the card's acceptable targets. And then this is going to loop through every single acceptable target and make sure that it matches our current target. As long as one of them matches our current target, then we're allowed to hit. So for each target, so if one of the targets in our target list current target is equal to our entity's target type, then we can target it. So all you need is you need one match, right? So if our player can attack enemies, opponents, yada, 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 whatever you want, as long as you have one match, one of those creatures that you can attack, then you can target it. So that's basically how that works. That's it for the arrows. Again, you're going to need to make your own line renderer script if you want to go along with this. I would recommend doing it here in the targeting arrow where it says draw line. That's originally where it was. So you're going to want to draw a line whenever you start dragging, basically. So good luck with that. So let's see if we're done with entities. Is that pretty much it for entities? I do believe so. Let's take a look at our player script now. Our player script, and if we go into our player prefab as well, you can take a look. We do have a player prefab which is spawned onto the network. This is actually pretty important because if we go into our network manager, here we have a player prefab that needs to be spawned into the game. So even though it's blank and it's just a blank thing that holds information, it's still important that we need to have. Here we have caster type, which of course is going to be owner. Whenever your opponent spawns into the game, they're also set to owner, but locally on your screen, they'll be set to enemy. Then whether or not it's a taunt, this is an entity variable, not a player variable. Oh yes, then we have the deck. We have the deck script, which is only on our player entity. Here we have the starting deck. The length of our deck is only 5 cards. Not really, because here we have the card, which is the whale, which is a creature card, scriptable object card. And then we have how many whale cards, how many duck cards, how many hippo, how many kings do we have? And we have 26 kittens. So in total, we have 30 cards. Then whenever we spawn a card, CMD load deck. So here you can see starting deck length. So right here, this is 5. Starting deck length, card amount. We're going to loop through every single card in our starting deck. So we're going to loop through all 5 of these. And then for every single amount of those cards, we're going to loop once more. So we loop through every single card in our deck, then we loop for every amount, then we add every single card into our hand. So here, as long as we have less than 7 cards, we add it into our hand, and then we shuffle our hand. And the way shuffling works, again, is something I'm quite proud of because it's my first time with these extensions. What we do is I created an extension that converts sync lists into regular lists. So we just create a temporary list, and then we just pass the information through it. We just populate it with the information from the sync list, and then we return the regular list. Then once it's been converted into a list, basically we use for the shuffling function, we use our previous sync list and we create a brand new list, and we randomly select a card from our sync list and we add it into our regular list. So maybe the 7th card we add first, so then the 7th card becomes the first card. Our 2nd card we choose second, so our 2nd card remains second. Maybe the 4th card in our sync list becomes the 3rd card in our new list. So basically we're shuffling the cards in that way, and we're removing the cards from the sync list afterwards, just to make sure that we don't get the same card twice. And then what happens is that we end up creating a brand new list that has been shuffled, and you could shuffle over and over and over and over again if you want to create more randomness. But shuffling just once for me is fine. And in the player, and this is what it ends up looking like: deck hand shuffle. Super convenient extension where you can just call the shuffling function whenever you want to shuffle. Just call the shuffling function and let it handle everything for you. This is where it gets a little bit janky. So here you have the sprite card back. This is saved on the player in case maybe you want the players to have custom. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick since this video is getting long. Maybe you want the player to have a custom card back like Hearthstone does. Every player is allowed to have their own unique card back. So this is where you would handle that information. Basically, you could just give different players different card backs. And whenever you spawn the card into the game using the player hand, using the hand card, whenever you spawn the card into a game, here add a card back, you could call this to update the color of the card back or the image of the card back based on the player's card back here, based on the sprite. It would be really, really simple to do. I didn't do it because it's just not something that was relevant for me yet, but it's something you can go ahead and do for yourself. Also, if you update mirror, you're going to need to remove the the sync var hook. You're going to need to remove it because it doesn't work in new mirror. I don't know why. It just doesn't work. So you're going to need to replace that and fix the naming stuff, the player's name. Here we have Taunt Count. The idea behind Taunt Count is that whenever you play a Taunt minion, this value will go up. So whenever you have a Taunt minion, the game needs to check, is there a taunt? So whenever you're targeting a creature or your opponent is targeting a creature, you need to check, is there a taunt on the board? Are we allowed to target these minions, or do we have to target the taunt first? Now, of course, if there's no taunt on the board, there's no reason for you to loop through that logic, to go through that logic and loop through every single card and say, okay, which card is a taunt, which card is not a taunt. Instead, we can just have a public int variable that tracks how many taunts we have on our side of the board, how many taunts are on our opponent's side of the board, and then this is synced var so that the server can access this information and keep it updated. And whenever your opponent plays a taunt, then it'll go up, and then, only once your opponent has a taunt on the board, then we start looping and checking if there's, who is taunted, who do we need to attack. And of course, this has not been implemented yet, but that's sort of like the idea behind it. Here we have a has enemy bool. So this is just, has the enemy been spawned into the game? Again, because of the way this game is set up, players spawn one at a time. So you're going to run into issues where the enemy is not spawned if you don't regularly perform checks to make sure that the player is actually still in the game. And then if you go into our update function, if we don't have an enemy and our username has not been set, then we update the enemy's info. So as long as we don't have an enemy, we're going to keep updating our enemy's info until they show up. So as long as we don't have an enemy, keep updating. So and how do we update? Well, it's pretty simple. We just find every single player in the game. Of course, because players can only connect one at a time, it means that by the time you run this function, you're going to be the only player on the game. So you're going to be the only player on the game. It's going to set you as a player, right? You're going to be set as a player, but it's going to loop through every single player, and basically player does not equal this. So whichever player is not you, there's only going to be two players. Whichever player is not you is automatically going to be your opponent because there's only two players. So unless you're your own opponent, if it's not you, it's your opponent. And then we set has enemy to true, and then we populate enemy info with current player info. Enemy info, once again, we can't pass the player struct through the network. The player class, sorry, you can't pass the player class through the network, but we can pass the player struct. So this is kind of the same thing. We we pass over the game object, and then we use that game object to recreate the player's information, the username, portrait, health, blah, 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 blah. So it just allows us to pass over players' statistics, stats, player info over the network. And here you can see at the bottom, we have a sync list for this exact thing. And in the game manager, we actually use it here. Sync list player info players. I don't know what I use this for. I do not remember, but it's information of all online players. So it's maybe relevant. Yeah, basically. So whichever player is not us is going to be our opponent. And here, enemy info data caster type target opponent. So this is just locally on our screen. He becomes our opponent. On their screen, of course, they are the owner. So they have different values based on relative to who's playing the game. All right. Whew, so much talking. How much time? 45 minutes. Not too bad. I think there's just a couple things to go over. We haven't taken a look at the combat script yet, but it is pretty self-explanatory. There's definitely some things that I've glossed over, but it's not that big of a deal. I think most of you guys should understand the thought process behind how a lot of these things work. It's not flawless. It's not perfect. It's loopholed and sort of like glued together, really crudely glued together, but you're going to figure it out. Just mess around with it, change a couple things, break a couple things, and you'll figure it out. So here we have increase wait turn. So again, this has to happen on the server. You don't want players to have the ability to just increase their own wait turn whenever they want. Otherwise, I mean, I'm sure this is not secure. This whole script is not secure. I'm sure people can use game engines and whatnot and break the game. But the idea behind it is to prevent people from cheating. So you can't just increase your own wait turn. The server needs to make sure that the wait turn, that the server needs to be the one that calls the wait turn. And this just handles gaining or losing health. This handles killing the creature when they run out of health. So this is where the creature dies. This is changing the mana for the player. Only works on players, as you can see. If entity is player, so you cannot change the mana on mana on a creature card, only on a player card. And of course, the field card is an entity, but spell cards wouldn't necessarily need to be an entity, right? You can create different types of cards that can or can't be entities. If you wanted to, you could create a card that's like a Planeswalker in Magic the Gathering, or maybe you wanted to create a card that's more of maybe like a permanent, like a land, right? Like in Magic the Gathering, you have lands. So a land maybe doesn't need to be an entity because it doesn't need most of this stuff. It doesn't need combat. It doesn't need strength. It doesn't need any of that. Also, the card info here is syncvarred, as you can see. So every card's information is syncvarred across the server. And whenever we spawn a card, yes, this is important. I forgot to mention this earlier. Whenever we spawn a card here, we do update field card info, which is what if you go into the hand card here, update field card info, this just updates the field card info with how much strength did we have, what is our card's name, what is our card's description, what is our card's sprite. So this updates it so that whenever you hover over a card, the proper information will be revealed. And also, here we have sort of like a safety net. If our sprite, for whatever reason, has not been loaded, our name has not been loaded, or the text, which is the description, I believe, has not been loaded, then we need to load it. If any of these values has not been loaded for whatever reason, then we're going to load it automatically. So maybe your opponent disconnects, they log back into the game, there's some error where the images and whatnot aren't loaded anymore, so now we load it again. So we make sure that this information is always up to date. No matter what happens, we're going to update this information. The health and string and text is also always updated automatically, so that whenever they take damage right away, the information is updated. So it's very convenient. And then here, if we go into our field card, we have 3 different colors: hover color, ready color, target color. Ready color is the color in your not in your hand. Whenever it's your turn and the creature's wait turn is greater than 0, that means they're ready to attack, right? So this is the can attack, shine equals ready color. So this is going to shine in green. Then we have the hover color, which is whenever you hover over a card and you look at the information, your opponent will see it hover in blue, will see it outlined in blue. Whenever you are targeting a card, then it will outline in red. And here we can take a look at what that outline looks like actually. It's really, really simple. Just like that, we have this white thing on the background, and all we do, I'm actually proud of this as well. I think this is pretty smart. I fooled around online with a bunch of different ways to make the shine work, and then eventually this kind of just hit me, and I was like, oh right, I can just do that. Why didn't I think of that earlier? So here we just turn it on and off. That's it. Turn on, it looks like it's shining. Turn off, not shining anymore. Turn on, shining, off, shining. So it's just a really, really simple way to create a shine effect without really being demanding at all, without needing any shaders or anything like that. And then if we can't attack, then we clear the color. Of course, we remove the shine. I think now that's got to be it. Actually, there's probably one more thing to do, which is field card hover. Yes. So this is what handles, this is the information that this is what handles what happens when you hover over a card. So by default, we set a delay of 0.4. Basically, what this does, if I go into field card and I remove, where is the delay? Am I blind? There we go, delay. We set this delay to 0, for example. Then we run the game. Then I launch the game. We do this, do that. Instantly, as soon as you hover your mouse over it, it appears. So this is super annoying. Imagine if you have a bunch of cards and you're kind of just scrolling through, it just appears and your opponent has cards. Super, super annoying. We don't want to do that. So we set a delay. We set the delay of 0.4 because it just feels a little bit better, a little bit smoother, a little bit more natural. But if you wanted to set a longer delay or shorter delay, you can go ahead and do that. So now whenever we hover over the cards, you will see that there is a little bit of a delay before it spawns. So this means that whenever you just hover over a card accidentally, it doesn't spawn. So it's not annoying, it doesn't get in the way, and you just hover, you wait, boom. I tried a couple different things. I felt like 0.3 was just a little bit too fast. It was still possible to accidentally do it, but 0.4 might be a little bit slow, but it feels quite nice. And then this handles hiding the card. Whenever you spawn the card arrow here, we spawn the targeting arrow, so we hide the hover. We don't hover the card anymore. This sends information right here. Here, field card hover, CMD on field card hover sends information to tell the game what color to hover the card, what color to shine, outline the card, which is right here, CMD field card hover. Do we send activate shrine, or do we send targeting shrine? So here we have hover color or target color, which is what I was showing earlier in the field card. If we go right here, hover color, target color. So this is where that logic is handled. I think that's pretty much it. I think this goes over every single thing in the game. It's sort of like a very, very quick, brief overview of absolutely everything that happens in the game. There's probably something I forgot, probably something I overlooked. Let's take a look at let's take a look at our script hierarchy real quick. Okay, yes, I already noticed something that I forgot. So there's a manager HUD here. All that I did here is I added little scripts. The manager HUD, if you go into our network manager, here you have manager HUD CCG. All that this does relative to a normal manager HUD is that I added this little line here where you can type in your name. And if I type no, then of course it shows up at no. And if I try to connect again, it'll set no as the default. So that's just what that does. And here in our scriptable cards, I set abilities. Now again, I never actually built this into the game, but I was starting to work on it. And the idea behind abilities, you might be thinking, why would I want to do abilities as a scriptable object? Well, the reason for that is just so that you don't have to hard code every single ability. So let's say your card has a battle cry, or has an effect that happens whenever you summon it onto the board. Let's say it deals 3 damage. And another card deals 2 damage, another card deals 5 damage when it lands on the board, but maybe it only deals 5 damage to beasts, right? To a creature of a certain type. Well, you don't want to have to hard code that into every single card in the game. That would be crazy. That would be obnoxious. Instead, you could just create a scriptable object that deals 3 damage, or maybe that deals X amount of damage. Then you can program that to make it deal 3 damage. Then you can have a different scriptable object, scriptable ability that maybe says, target beasts only, right? So whenever you're creating a card, here in the initiatives, you would add a bunch of different initiatives. And then you can see ability type. So here we can actually take a look. I started working on this, but I never finished it. But this was the theory behind it. Ability type: damage, heal, strength, health, draw, discard. Now, of course, you could have one variable for this. So, for example, maybe damage would be minus. Whenever it's in the negative, you deal damage, or -3. Whenever it's healing, +3. Whenever strength and health, I think you want to keep separate. Draw, discard. Whenever it's 3, then you draw cards. Whenever it's -3, for example, then you discard a card until end of turn. How long does the effect last? And this is the code that would be called whenever you summon the card. Whenever you do something, this is what would happen. And of course, this would be used, but Scriptable Abilities would also be used for spell cards. So if you have a creature that whenever you spawn the creature, it deals 3 damage, and you have a spell that does the exact same thing, then why code that twice? Just use the same Scriptable card object and have it deal 3 damage to whatever target you want it to deal at. So here, if you take a look, you can set the ability type. What kind of ability is it? Then you can set what kind of people can be targeted by that ability. So it was starting to shape up, and then the ability itself. So here you can put the Scriptable ability. So you can put the ability itself here on top of that. So it was starting to shape up into being like an actual feature. It's something that I was working on. And yeah, the idea is just that by having Scriptable Abilities, you can program cards so much more efficiently, card effects so much more efficiently. You could have one Scriptable ability that deals 3 damage. The other one is to draw 2 cards, and then you can just put them together. You can have 2 initiatives. First initiative, deal 3 damage. Second initiative, draw 2 cards. So then whenever you play the card, both would happen, and it would go through the queue in the order that you put them in. So it'll attack first and then draw first if that's the order that you want. And Scriptable Abilities, of course, is going to be the same thing for death rattles. 1 second. Okay. So Scriptable Abilities, of course, are going to be the same thing for the death rattles, the dying effects. If whenever someone dies, you wanted to draw a card, you want to discard a card, why would you go ahead and program that 5 times when you can just grab a Scriptable ability that already does that, put it in your death abilities, and then voila, everything is done. It is a little bit of a more complicated system because there's a lot of foundation that you have to set up, but eventually later down the line, it'll end up panning and allowing you to create a much, much more efficient workflow, and you'll be able to just pump out a bunch of cards once you've set up. But again, the foundation is difficult. There's a lot of things to take into account, a lot of things you need to set up. For example, this might not be something that you thought about, but this is something that became a hurdle for me when I was developing this. I remember the queues. So if you take a look at a game like Hearthstone, there's a queue for every animation, every attack, right? So if, for example, I summon a creature and my creature kills something on the board that has a death rattle, a death effect, that death effect will happen after the battle cry, but it will happen after my creature has been spawned. So first step is the battle cry does something. Second step is my creature is summoned. Third step is death rattle takes effect. So you have a certain queue of events where things happen in a specific order. So this is something you're going to need to take into account. Does the death rattle of my opponent's card happen before or after my creature is actually summoned? Does the battle cry happen before or after the creature is summoned? Do I play the creature first and then do the battle cry, or does the battle cry happen before my creature even enters the board, right? So these are different things that will affect the gameplay and will affect the balance, because it means that there's you will be able to play around abilities and set up attacks and set up plans and strategies differently based on how the cards interact with one another. And Hearthstone has a very, very complex system. It's very difficult sometimes to figure out how the interaction is gonna pan out, and you kind of just sit there and watch as something happens. And I think the best example of why this is important in your game is if you take a look at Hearthstone and you look at the Pyromaniac. The Pyromaniac, every time you play a card, it deals 1 damage to all the creatures on the board. And this card combined with Priest, there are so many things happening at once, so many effects happening at once. If Pyromaniac kills a minion, then that minion does a death rattle. It's death rattle animation. It gets so complicated. It gets so convoluted. So many different things happening at once. So you're really going to want to figure out, how do I queue up all these different abilities? Okay, so that's enough for my rant. If you have any questions, if there's anything I overlooked, anything that doesn't make sense, if I just spoke too quickly for the entire video and you think, hey, Nick, actually, I would much prefer if you could spend an extra hour, but do it slower. Take your time, speak slowly, and explain to me again how all of this works. Even if it takes an extra hour, I'm willing to watch it. If enough people tell me that that's something that they might be interested in, then I'll go ahead and do that. But otherwise, I think you can just slow down the speed of this video, or maybe just watch it more than once, right? And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below instead of on itch.io so that I can answer those questions here. And if other people have the same questions, they can see it in the comment section. If you like the video, please like the video, share it if you think anyone will be interested in it, and leave a comment again to help out the algorithm. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope this is useful. I hope you enjoy making games with this. If you create anything of value, anything that you want to showcase, anything you want to show off, please send me a message. Please send me some screenshots. Try to get in contact with me because I would love to see what you guys end up creating with this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.